Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. China's president tells the president of France and the European Commission he's ready to reset relations with Europe following wide-ranging talks in Beijing. Our other headlines, they were bitter rivals in the Middle East, a landmark meeting of ministers from Iran and Saudi Arabia in China. Protesters in Paris stormed the office of the US investment company BlackRock in the latest unrest over pension reform. And the return of the Kennedys. Robert F. Kennedy, nephew of President John F. Kennedy, will seek the Democratic nomination for US President against Joe Biden. China's President Xi has been meeting French President Emmanuel Macron and EU leader Ursula von der Leyen in Beijing. Xi welcomed Macron in a state ceremony, followed by a series of meetings where the leaders discussed trade, China-Europe diplomatic relations and the war in Ukraine. President Xi said China is ready to reset relations with the EU. He also called for political solutions to the Ukraine war. Well, CGTN's correspondent Yo Yang is in Beijing. Yo Yang, what are the key messages coming out of these talks?
Yes, Jamie, it's quite a busy day. Actually, French President Emmanuel Macron and the President of the EU company von der Leyen is going to wrap up their three-day visit to China on Friday. And this afternoon, after meeting with his French counterpart, Chinese President Xi Jinping said that the country is willing to work together with France, calling on the international community to resolve the Russia-Ukraine crisis through political means and dialogues. And they also asked the related parties to maintain rational restraints and avoid taking action that further worsen the current situation. And meanwhile, they're also calling the related parties to strictly abide by international humanitarian law, protect the women and children in the conflicts. At the same time, fulfill the commitment of not using nuclear weapons and not engaging in nuclear war, restart peace talks as soon as possible, and try to cope with the spillover effects of the conflicts in global issues such as food, energy, finance, transportation and other areas, and reducing the negative impact of conflicts to the world, especially the developing countries.
On the Ukraine crisis, China is committed to promote peace talks and a political settlement. China would like to join France in calling on the international community to exercise rational restraint and avoid taking actions that may make the crisis worse or even get out of control.
L'agression russe en Ukraine a porté un coup.
The Russian aggression in Ukraine has dealt a blow to this stability. It ended decades of peace in Europe. I know I can count on you, moreover under the two principles I have just mentioned, to bring Russia to its senses and everyone to the negotiating table.
One of the other noteworthy things that the former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin, President of the French Constitutional Council, Laurent Fabius, several French ministers and members of parliament, as well as more than 60 leaders of large enterprises, including financial institutions and aviation companies like Airbus, and over 20 cultural representatives have also accompanied the French president during his visit. So experts say these are showing the gesture that the continent still values pragmatic cooperation with China. In fact, we have some data here released by Eurostat know that last year, China was the third largest partner for EU exports of goods and the largest partner for EU imports of goods. And as we talked with Mr. Jörg Butzke ahead of the European leaders' trip, he believes as the world is gradually recovering from the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, trade cooperation between the two sides is expected to expand in the coming future. Back to you, Jamie.
Yang, thank you for that. Our correspondent Yo Yang in Beijing. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier, who's in Brussels. Alex, we heard Yo Yang talking about the business and the trade delegation accompanying this essentially political visit. What does Europe want from President Macron and von der Leyen's visit?
Well, Jamie, you've got a bit of a double act going on, two different priorities, two different agendas, and also two different constituencies for both leaders. Ursula von der Leyen is in China. She delivered a speech last week on the EU's relationship with China to effectively find a new relationship, build a different kind of relationship, understanding that there are differences, and really trying to work through those and find what she calls decoupling through diplomacy. But she is answerable to 27 member states who don't all have the same position on China. You have some more hawkish countries like the Baltic states, Lithuania in particular, which has had a long-running dispute with China. On the other hand, you have countries like France, like President Macron, that are keen to boost trade with China. And Emmanuel Macron is the perfect embodiment of this. He has traveled with a very large business delegation, the head of Airbus, the head of a zoo, an electronic music producer. Lots of different business leaders and ministers coming with President Macron. On the other hand, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, coming with no delegation, effectively, meeting with Mr. Wuttke, who we've just heard about, the head of the EU-China Chamber of Commerce in China, and having limited meetings, but then having that bilateral meeting with President Xi and the trilateral adding President Macron. So the priorities for Ursula von der Leyen are pretty clear. There is the geopolitical side of it. Ursula von der Leyen, like President Macron, wants China to exert its influence against Russia, encouraging Russia to end its invasion of Ukraine, expecting China to play a role in trying to bring about some kind of settled peace, and saying that China has a responsibility to do so. Ursula von der Leyen also welcoming President Xi, saying that he is willing to talk to President Zelensky of Ukraine when the time is right. That shows a little bit more proximity between the two sides. And finally, Ursula von der Leyen laying out that the EU has to de-risk, so moving away from trade dependence on China, moving away from dependence on China on critical raw materials, for example, but not decouple altogether. And that de-risking has to happen through diplomacy, through conversation. So a real delicate balancing act for Ursula von der Leyen, representing 27 member states, and Emmanuel Macron with much more of a charm offensive in Beijing.
It's a packed agenda. What's the plan for President Macron and Ursula von der Leyen for Friday?
Well, the plan for Friday really embodies what I was just talking about, Jamie. Ursula von der Leyen will be on the plane heading back to Brussels. She went for those meetings with Chinese leader, for that meeting with President Xi, but will not be participating in more events, will be really sticking to that diplomatic visit, whereas President Macron has 3 events, meeting students in China tomorrow morning, has a dinner with President Xi as well, and also meeting with business leaders. So that really shows you the different scope. Ursula von der Leyen very much going there to have a diplomatic meeting, whereas President Macron and his delegation having a much broader approach, an approach that will receive criticism by some of his European partners, but nevertheless very different priorities for both. Ursula von der Leyen heading home shortly, Emmanuel Macron in China for another day.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Well, let's talk now to Jacques Rellard, a fellow of the London-based think tank, the Global Policy Institute. He joins us from Saint-Malo in France. Jacques Rellard, welcome. Good to see you. The Russia-Ukraine conflict clearly big on the agenda for this Beijing visit. Realistically, what expectation is there that any progress might be made on Ukraine with this visit?
Macron hoped against hope, I would say, that maybe China would act as a peacemaker in the conflict in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine. But that's not the case, and it's not in China's interest. It's far from China, and China has actually benefited from the situation in the couple between Russia and China. China now has clearly the upper hand. China has also some side benefits, such as cheap gas, for example. But actually, there was a breakthrough, which was quite important, in my opinion, in the fact that Xi Jinping put out some red lines. He clearly said that in this conflict, he was totally against, he would not condone the use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapon, biochemical weapon. So that is quite a step, telling Putin, who has been threatening to use nuclear weapons in Belarus or elsewhere, that not to go too far, to bring him to his senses in a way, not to get involved yet in a peace movement, although the French source said that maybe Xi Jinping will call Zelensky, which he hasn't done yet. That's a French source, so I don't know whether it's so a Chinese, but it's a positive step forward, and it shows that actually this meeting happened in good harmony, and that both countries agreed on a certain vision of the world, of the future world order, which is quite similar.
What would be good outcomes from these meetings, from this gathering? I mean, how do you see Europe and China relations moving forward beyond the ceremonials?
I think that Europe and China's relation will move towards agreement. Europe doesn't want a confrontational attitude to China, unlike the USA at the moment. And Europe is an ally, obviously, is part of NATO, ally with America, but not necessarily allied. And that's always been the view of Emmanuel Macron, who always saw Europe as a political identity with its own interests, own values to defend in this multipolar world. They agree on the concept of the multipolar world. They don't want an American world order. They don't want a Chinese world order. They would like it to be human rights and international law based order. And in that sense, there's both seem today the tune music was actually quite positive in that sense. And there was a problem with China as far as Europe was concerned. Therefore, there was too many risks in doing trade with China. As we saw during the COVID crisis, the supply chain kind of stopped for a while and undermined European interests. And also, there's the issue that there's no reciprocity. And Macron and von der Leyen were insistent that there should be reciprocity in agreements. And I think that China is ready to move because China now, the foreign trade of China is suffering from American sanctions. And Europe is actually the main importers of Chinese goods. 20% of European imports come from China. So Europe needs China, but they need to rebalance in a fairer way their relationship. At the same time, Macron added the issue that there's a big issue which concerns the whole world is global warming and the fight to preserve biodiversity. And there they have agreed on joint action on that field. And that's very important for Europe too.
Jacques Relan, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Jacques Relan, fellow of the London-based think tank, the Global Policy Institute. Now the rest of the day's news, and former bitter Middle East rivals Iran and Saudi Arabia have held talks for the first time in 7 years in a landmark deal brokered by China last month. The previously staunch enemies agreed to restore ties following years of hostility that fueled conflicts right across the region. Tehran and Riyadh's foreign ministers have met in Beijing, where they discussed reopening embassies and resuming flights. Our correspondent Huang Yue reports.
In a joint statement, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to launch arrangements to reopen embassies and consulates within 2 months. The foreign minister said the two sides will examine ways of expanding cooperation, including resuming flights, bilateral visits of official and private sector delegations. They also agreed to facilitate the granting of visas for the two countries' citizens. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Qin Gang also held talks with the two foreign ministers. The meetings follow a landmark agreement brokered by China last month for Saudi Arabia and Iran to restore diplomatic ties. Qin said China highly appreciates the high-level interactions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and supports the two sides in mapping out the plans for future development of bilateral relations. He also emphasized that the regional countries should get rid of external interference and hold the future and destiny of the Middle East in their own hands. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran have expressed their appreciation for China's mediation. Against the backdrop of the international uncertainty, some experts say the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran is of great significance not only to the region, but also to the world. By improving the relations, the two countries are said to have opened the door to peace in the Middle East and set an example of settling disputes via dialogue. China says as a trustworthy friend of both Saudi Arabia and Iran, it will continue to play a constructive role in the process. Huang Yue, CGTN, Beijing.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Not so much storming the Bastille, but storming BlackRock. Protesters in France target the world's biggest asset manager in the latest demonstrations over pension reform.
This week on Razor, how saving one species can save an ecosystem. On the trail of European bison.
We have here, as you can see, a nice trail through thick vegetation here, which is done by the bison. It's one of the roads they have in nature. They basically create these pathways through thick vegetation where other smaller animals can't cross.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. China's president tells the president of France and the European Commission he's ready to reset relations with Europe following wide-ranging talks in Beijing. Our other headlines, they were bitter rivals in the Middle East, a landmark meeting of ministers from Iran and Saudi Arabia in China. Now, more protests are taking place across France after talks between the government and unions failed to end months of gridlock over pension reform. The controversial changes include raising the legal retirement age from 62 to 64. The bill was passed by the Senate last month, but later the government forced it through the National Assembly without a vote. This is the 11th round of strikes since January, with hundreds of thousands of people joining the protests.
Following this meeting, I appeal for the maximum number of workers and citizens in this country to join the demonstrations everywhere in France. We need to demonstrate the strength of social democracy and do it calmly without violence. I call on as many workers as possible to mobilise.
Well, beyond the politics, the protests continue. I think we can show you now, these are the live pictures on the Reuters feed. This is the scene in Paris at the moment, and you can see some pretty difficult pictures there of French police, riot police, I think, moving in on the crowds, and you can see the size of the crowds there. Difficult to put a number on it, but I think we can say with some certainty, certainly hundreds, possibly 1,000 demonstrators gathered there in this latest round of demonstrations against President Macron's pension reform. We'll stay on the pictures, and I think we should be able to bring in the voice of our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris, who's watching the events for us. Ross, we're staying with these pictures. The talks have collapsed. And we are clearly seeing another day of not just strikes, but protests. I mean, is there any way out of this?
Yeah, the talks were taking place on Wednesday. They lasted under an hour. The unions walking out of that meeting with French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne because they said they would start with a discussion about scrapping the reform, at least scrapping the raising of the retirement age. And Elisabeth Borne saying we'll start by saying that we need to keep this reform in place because it is of beneficial to the French economy. Let's listen in now to what Elisabeth Borne had to say.
It was a respectful exchange where everyone was able to express themselves and listen to each other. I listened to each of the trade union organizations. I heard their disagreements on raising the retirement age, and I was able to repeat to them my conviction and that of my government of the need for this reform.
Yeah, so you can see Elisabeth Borne just reiterating the government position that has been the position since January, that they want to continue with this reform because it is needed to make France's pension system financially sustainable in the future. But as you pointed out, since the 19th of January, we have been seeing here in France week after week of protests, marches and strikes. They're ongoing again. The bins here in the French capital have once again not been collected as garbage workers are now back on strike. And we're seeing those demonstrations continue here in Paris. They were going to be taking place whether or not the talks took place with Elisabeth Borne this week. The unions had already said the 11th day of mass mobilisation would be the 6th of April, and we are expecting at the end of this day the unions to announce their next date. They say they will continue with this until the government scraps its reforms, which ministers have no intention of doing.
Ross, we've just been reporting on President Macron and his visit to China. So he's clearly out of the country at the moment. He's not in Paris, he's not in France. Is that going to be a welcome distraction or something of, given these pictures, a political mistake?
Last month in March, Jamie, Emmanuel Macron went down south in France to launch his water plan to combat the serious problems of drought that we have here in France, and he was criticised for focusing on another policy issue when his detractors said he should be focusing on the pensions crisis. Emmanuel Macron says there's lots of other national and international issues we need to be getting on with. We can't be hamstrung by continuing to discuss the pension reform. One of those international issues is trying to reset relations with the Chinese president. Obviously, he's there at the moment in China with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, continuing that work at a high geopolitical level to continue to have those international discussions as he continues to have national policy discussions. Earlier in the week, he was discussing improving the policy in France towards ends of a life and assisted suicide and euthanasia. And so he wants to continue to discuss other policies outside the pension reform, which he is leaving pretty much to his Prime Minister Elizabeth Bourne.
Ross, thank you for that. That's the voice of our correspondent, Ross Cullen, in Paris. And you're watching live pictures from Paris on the latest standoff between what looked like French riot police, or certainly police in riot gear, and demonstrators in the latest round of protests taking place in France, protests and strikes demonstrating against President Macron's pension reforms, a story that we'll return to in later hours here on CGTN. There's uproar in Greece after a police officer fired shots into the air during a protest in Athens. In exclusive footage obtained by CGTN, scuffles broke out on Wednesday between the police and demonstrators protesting outside this university. The group used bins as barricades and then set some of them on fire when a passing police car was attacked with what appeared to be stones. One of the police officers pulled out a gun and shot 4 times into the air. Well, our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas is in Athens. Evangelo, what's been the political fallout from this?
Well, this has been dominating the local news since the moment the incident occurred. There was some clashes that took place today, just for about 20 minutes or half an hour, but nothing too large, the ones that we've seen in the previous days. But the major fallout, as I said earlier, is this the debate that is happening now between the political parties, because this video from CGTN that's been appearing on social media is the only video that shows the police officer holding that gun in his hand, and that has become a topic of debate. The opposition party is now claiming that the government is using excessive force in these kind of protests, with the government saying that clearly the police officer was in danger and he had no other choice but to use that gun. As I said, all the media now are circulating that video and discussing about it. It has become a topic of debate. It's been raised on a lot of media here, local media. It has even brought questions into the Greek parliament of why this happened and why it could have taken place. Now, there was clearly a message from the headquarters of the police not for the police officers to pass through that area because of the incident. Now, the question is, why did the police officer go through there, knowing that there was an incident happening, but as well, how quick and how fast the police officer could pull out his gun to shoot in the air. Now, again, it happened in front of a university. Hundreds of people were around. Ourselves, me and our cameraman, were there in front of the incident. We're only 20 meters away from that police officer, and clearly in that video that you showed previously, the second time the gun is pointing almost directly towards what appear to be those rioters. So it is a question of why he pulled out his gun so fast. Now, again, the police officer is going to be taken to court, and there are cases against them of using excessive firearm.
Evangelo, thank you for that. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas reporting from Athens. A member of America's most famous political dynasty is challenging Joe Biden for the U.S. presidency in 2024. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., nephew of the assassinated John F. Kennedy, is running in the Democratic race for the White House. Let's speak to our correspondent, John Terrett. John, this is, well, it's a historic perhaps, but certainly a bold move.
Yes. It certainly is bold because here is Robert Kennedy Jr. beating the boss to the announcement that he's running for the top job at the White House in 2024. Joe Biden of the same Democratic Party has yet to announce whether he will run. We think he will, but you have to remember if he does run in 2024 and he wins, he'll be 86 years old when he finishes the term, if he completes his term. And there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party, polls suggest, would be rather keen if there was actually somebody else to replace him in 2024. Now, it's significant because the Kennedy name is significant. It is a storied name. It's associated with wealth and power and politics. There are other political families like this around. The Bushes representing the Republicans, the Obamas, of course, and indeed the Cuomos, whose power base lies in the state of New York. Well, who is Robert Kennedy Jr.? Well, he is an environmental lawyer by trade. He's also an anti-vaxxer, which makes him a relatively, in some people's eyes, controversial candidate. Jamie?
He's the second Democrat to announce. What does that say about satisfaction with Joe Biden's presidency, or is this just normal stuff?
Well, he is the second candidate to announce, but the first one didn't make as many headlines. She is the self-help guru and spiritualist Marianne Williamson. She's 70 years old. She's written a number of New York Times bestsellers. But I bring you back again to the storied nature of the Kennedy name. And here we have history repeating itself because Robert Kennedy Jr.'s father, who was Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who was assassinated by Sirhan, he announced in the 1968 presidential election that he intended to run for the White House before the then Democratic incumbent LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had a chance to say that he was actually pulling out of the race, which he did do. So history seems to be repeating itself. That election was eventually won, of course, by the Republican Richard Nixon. But, you know, briefly, there is dissatisfaction, I suspect, with Joe Biden. Partly his age and the fact that he will be the oldest president if he gets to the end of his second term, if indeed he wins. He is seen by many in his party as being too centre-left. I think that many of them in the party would like to promote the Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first African-American and Asian vice president. And on the plus side, Biden has beaten Donald Trump. And if Trump is the candidate in 2024, which despite everything we reported on this week, he still could be, then that's a plus card for Joe Biden because he's already beaten the man who's likely to run for the Republicans. Finally, there is a sense of disappointment in the country, and it's centered around inflation and interest rates and Ukraine and the fact that we're still at the back end of COVID-19. And all of that, I think, doesn't bode well necessarily for Joe Biden. But on the other hand, he's still known as Uncle Joe within his party among many members. Even polls suggest that many Democrats would rather have somebody else. So it all rather remains to be seen. But Kennedy has taken the headlines today, Jamie.
Uncle Joe. Uncle John, thank you for that. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. The headlines again. China's president tells the president of France and the European Commission he's ready to restart engagement with Europe following wide-ranging talks in Beijing. Our other headlines, they were bitter rivals in the Middle East. A landmark meeting of ministers from Iran and Saudi Arabia has taken place in China. And protesters in Paris stormed the office of US investment company BlackRock in the latest unrest over pension reform. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel, on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.